From hostile takeovers to, well, hostile takeovers. Stay tuned to number 1 to find out what country was created by sheer brute force. Number 10. USA. Okay, this one should be a no-brainer for most. The vast areas which today are a part of the USA were once colonized by many European countries from the 16th century onwards. England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands were there first, followed by later settlers to the new land. It would be impossible to fit the colonial history of the US into this brief overview, but you can be sure it's full of death, adventure, innovation and new design, horror and atrocities, personal stories from both sides, and many other geographical and political changes which have ultimately, for better or worse, shaped the USA as it is today. From the colonial period of the early 16th century onwards, the indigenous people of modern-day US have experienced massacres, terror, systematic military occupations, removal from ancestral territories, destruction of ritual and ancestral lands, and much more. When you think about the United States, just like South America and other places around the world, it's important not to forget that their often brutal history is what created their current countries today. Number 9. The islands of Hawaii. Okay, so technically this is now a part of the US, but the Hawaiian Islands were first settled by Polynesians sometime between 124 and 1120 CE, and went on to experience a period of isolation for 500 years before the Europeans showed up, led by British explorer James Cook. The islands were later unified by King Kamehameha, who conquered the other rulers and established the Kingdom of Hawaii. The native Hawaiian population suffered significant losses soon after the first contact, with estimates suggesting their population went from around 300,000 to only 70,000 in under 50 years. After all of this, in 1893, American colonists, who controlled Hawaii's sugar-based economy, overthrew the kingdom and established the Republic of Hawaii. And within 5 years, the US had annexed Hawaii as a territory, forming the eventual state as we know it today. The contact with the West and subsequent colonialism and other Western influences accelerated the deconstruction of the Hawaiian religion and society, which had stood for over 600 years. Number 8. Australia. We're traveling to the other side of the world for this next entry. Australia, like Hawaii and all of the other examples on this list, had a thriving culture before colonial powers decided to colonize the land. As with the Native Americans, the colonial power, in this case the English, forced the Aborigines off their land, and many were beaten and killed, while others contracted diseases that the colonists brought with them. When the English arrived in 1788, there was believed to be hundreds of thousands, possibly even millions of native Australians across the land. With an estimated 250 to 300 different languages believed to have been in use at the time of contact, more than half of these have disappeared altogether. Unfortunately, through the actions of the colonists, many tribes were completely wiped out, while others battled to maintain their culture. The colonists first named the land New South Wales, and it wasn't until 1794 that the name Australia was specifically applied to the land. However, it additionally wasn't until 1817 that Australia appears to have been officially used. As with each of the other entries on this list, a mere 200 words is not enough to explain the atrocities committed by the English, or to explain the new technological advances that they brought with them. But there are plenty of books, documentaries, and sources available for your investigation. Number 7. Myanmar. Myanmar has been in the news a lot in the recent months due to the plight of the Rohingya Muslim population who are being driven from their homes. The prehistory of modern-day Myanmar dates back to 11,000 BCE, and from 200 BCE onwards, different kingdoms rose and fell. Then, in 1824, the British decided to colonize the country, which was then known as Burma, and subsequently became known as British Burma. Before the arrival of the British, Burma was wealthy because of its strategic positions between China and India, and was ruled by the Kongbong dynasty. When the British colonized the country, they disposed of the royal family, and they exiled to India, where they lived for over 20 years before the death of the last king of Burma. Traditional Burmese society was drastically altered by the demise of their monarchy, and the British controlled their new province through direct rule, making various changes to the governmental structure as well as influencing some cultural changes. It wasn't until 1937 that Britain separated the Burma province from the British India, and it would be a further 11 years until they gained their own independence from the UK. The official name chosen for the country at the time of independence was Burma, but today the country is known as Myanmar, or Myanmar in English. The different names for the modern-day Myanmar are so complex as to not do it justice in just one video. Number 6. Ivory Coast. Côte d'Ivoire, also known as the Ivory Coast, was a French colony. 5 important states flourished in the Ivory Coast in the pre-European era. When Europeans first started commercial contact with West Africa, the Ivory Coast was subject to the influences the Europeans brought with them. However, permanent trading posts were not immediately established. It wasn't until 1893 that the Ivory Coast was officially made a French colony. The local rulers ultimately lost their sovereignty in part because they were unable to counter French deception and military force. Once France had control of the colony, they set about traveling inland to establish new posts and often met resistance from locals, such as Samori Touré, who established an empire that extended over parts of modern-day Ivory Coast. As with every other colonial power, the French used military force to squash the resistance and succeeded in capturing Touré in 1898. But this wasn't the first or last time France would have to fight to maintain its control. In 1905, the French officially abolished slavery in most of French West Africa. However, they continued to govern the area, often adopting divide-and-rule policies to maintain power. Finally, in 1960, the Ivory Coast, as it is known today, gained full independence from France. But this was not the end of the troubles for the region, and in the subsequent years they saw civil wars and conflict with France, which continued all the way into the 21st century. Number 5. Argentina. Like many other modern South American countries, Argentina was colonized by the Spanish. In fact, the easiest way to know which South American countries were colonized by the Spanish Empire is by looking at which countries still have Spanish as their official language today. The country, as we know it today, didn't exist pre-colonial period. And even during Spanish rule in the region, the boundaries were not as they are today. The history of Argentina can be divided into 4 main parts: pre-Columbian times, the colonial period, which ended in 1810, the nation-building period, and then modern Argentina, from 1880 onwards. It wasn't until the Peninsular War in Spain and the capture of the Spanish King Ferdinand VII that many of Spain's colonies in the Americas thought that, without a king, the people should rule themselves. This ultimately resulted in the Revolution of 1810. Although the country we know today as Argentina was not formed at this point, modern-day Argentina was shaped to some extent by its colonial past. Before we move on, take a moment to like this video and don't forget to subscribe to more videos from Zero to Hero. Number 4. New Zealand. New Zealand was the last habitable place in the world to be discovered. First settled by the ancestors of Maori, it's believed they arrived from Polynesia between 1200 and 1300 CE. The first Europeans, a Dutch explorer called Abel Tasman, visited the area in 1643, but it wasn't until 127 years later that another European visitor, this time our previously discussed Captain James Cook, visited the area. European whalers and sealers started visiting regularly, and then came the traders. By the 1830s, the British government was being pressured to curb lawlessness in the country and also to preempt the French, who were considering New Zealand as a potential colony, which resulted in the English establishing their own colony. Over the next couple of decades, the Maori, a term that didn't exist until the Europeans arrived, were forced to sell their land or have it taken from them. The independence of New Zealand is continuously debated, both academically and socially, and there is no fixed date for the independence. Instead, this topic is so debated that we can't even begin to scratch the surface of it in this video. But it is clear that modern-day New Zealand was shaped by its colonial past. Number 3. Brazil. As with many South American countries, the history of Brazil begins with indigenous people and dates back over thousands of years. The first inhabitants of Brazil are thought to have mainly lived on the coast and alongside rivers in semi-nomadic tribes, with no permanent buildings or written records. As a result, very little is known of this period. The Portuguese arrived in April of 1500, claiming Brazil for Portugal. From the 16th century, sugarcane plantations along the northeast coast became an important part of the country's economy. The Portuguese tried to use the native indigenous people as slaves to produce sugar for Europe, but in the end, they resorted to bringing in slaves from Africa. The first permanent Portuguese settlement was established at São Vicente in 1532. Salvador was founded by the Portuguese in 1549 as the first capital of Brazil, and it became a major port for slaves and sugarcane. From 1808, the Portuguese king ruled his vast empire from Rio de Janeiro, but 15 years later, after the Independence War, Brazil ceased to be a Portuguese colony, declaring independence from Portugal in 1822 and becoming the Empire of Brazil. Number 2. Algeria. The borders of modern Algeria were created by the French colonists who came to the area in 1830. As a result of earlier tensions, which are too complex to go into detail here, a French army landed in Algeria in June 1830. It then successfully gained control of some of the territory, and by 1847 they had largely suppressed the Algerian resistance to the invasion, and the following year they made Algeria a department of France. French colonists sought about modernizing Algeria's agricultural and commercial economy, but lived apart from the Algerian majority, enjoying social and economic privileges extended to few non-Europeans. After 132 years of subjugation by the French, Algeria finally gained independence in 1962. This finally brought an end to a savage period of history in which some 1.5 million Algerians died, mostly from aerial bombing raids and slaughter by army units. Hundreds of thousands more were tortured as an entire nation was made to pay for resisting the might of overseas rulers. Number 1. India. The British first became interested in India because of raw materials and the possibility of reaching vast amounts of consumers. The area known today as India, and which at the time included modern Pakistan, was operated by the East India Company and was later taken over by the British government. As with all colonized countries, there were significant downfalls for the native populations. Indian people ultimately became seen as lesser citizens in comparison to the English, and the British controlled both the government and the economy. While education, modern goods, transportation, healthcare, and other aspects are sometimes seen as benefits of colonization, many believe it doesn't justify the act of the colonization itself. Britain used the idea of divide and conquer by using Indian soldiers to fight and maintain their presence in other colonized countries, such as Burma, which was discussed earlier. The Indian Independence Act of 1947 saw the United Kingdom partition of British India into two new independent dominions, India and Pakistan, an act that later caused further bloodshed. Tell us how you think the world would be different without colonization in the comments below, and take care.